episode after I've only just finished downvoting your previous episodes without watching them. And obviously, just as you like to downvote multiple episodes a week, I like to create multiple episodes a week. So that was the NA edition we did, you know. I had a lot of fresh guests on that one. I had Saint Vicious, and I Will Dominate. And on this episode, we've got Hussain back again. So, as anyone who's started to follow this show has figured out by now, I recycle more than those cunts who watch fucking Al Gore documentaries and believe the shit in them. So at least with guests. At least I recycle guests. In real life, don't really do that much recycling. Mainly because it's all a scam. They take it all back to the landfill, put it all in the same hole. Didn't want to just be the guy who sort of explained to you that Father Christmas doesn't exist and that Al Gore is a billionaire for a reason. Don't know why this has got political. It has. It's gotten political, Hussain. But that's also because this is going to be an episode about tearing people down who've built up and had success and had big names. Because I thought to myself, who better to talk about the best teams in the EU LCS and the most successful than two bitter losers associated with teams who were the victims of those squads and failed to get winning records in this split. So welcome to the show, Hussain. Another warm welcome to Narrative.
Glad to be here.
Okay, because here's the thing. I actually thought this is the genius pairing, right? Because normally you should go with, you know, the counterbalance. You should get the person who's really optimistic about EU LCS who love to counterbalance Kelsey. But I thought, no, let's just explore the depths of the darkness and let's find out why, even though these are teams that, you know, they're all going for the championships and their storied legacies, I think in some way, some of them probably don't make the correct pick and bans and sometimes make macro mistakes. So let's focus on that. Right, so let's start with this, Hussain. Obviously, we should initially get some thoughts on Misfits.
Yeah.
Coming into this split, the interesting thing I thought about your team was, right, I would obviously have started the episode. If this was someone in Insight, I would just go straight balls deep on the fact that, like, you know, you came in, you had a big head after Worlds, you thought you were the best Western team, you know. Obviously, the split didn't go as well. You're nowhere close to contending to win the title. But I do have to point out, obviously, you had different players in the team. You had certain key figures leave the team. But at the same time, I have to then renege that. I can't take that away because almost everyone we did who've come on the show and mentioned Misfits, actually almost everyone said they thought the roster moves you made were sideways trades, that they weren't downgrades, they weren't like significant losses, you know, they should be able to be the same sort of team. So with all this added up, this split's got to be pretty underwhelming, right?
Oh yeah, this was complete garbage from us overall. There's like a lot of reasons obviously that went into it. There were mistakes, pretty glaring mistakes in terms of the direction we took as a team, both from staff and player end. And then, like, most people said they were side grades, but there were, like, in terms of pure individual skill, if people like mean it in that sense, that's fine, that makes sense. Okay. But in terms of other qualities that players bring to the team, there's a lot of differences between Cress and Mickey or Senkus Mix Mickey versus Heart of Evil and Ignar. Ignar was a pretty popular playmaker, I guess, from us. Like, everyone knew he was our primary playmaker, and also in that sense, he was very vocal, where Mickey is really, really good, possibly better in lane. Like, our 2v2 is more cohesive, more stronger in a lot of ways. But we had this issue that to some extent we ignored, and then when we tried to fix, we were kind of too late, which was that come mid-game, we would get these advantages, and then come mid-game, we wouldn't know how to, or no one would step up and actually make the proactive play. And that wasn't because people aren't capable of doing so, but rather because we didn't know how to communicate to that point. We were so intent on trying to play like the absolute perfect game to not make any mistake that we weren't actually going and forcing anything, which is a huge strength of the old roster. At any given point, if we wanted to make a play, we knew that we would be able to go and do so. So that was missing, and we struggled to identify and fix that issue. And then on top of that, I think in terms of synergies across the board too, we eventually gelled, but it took a really long time to get there. So people noticed that like we had a winning record at the start, and then we took a dip. But in reality, we had these issues from the beginning itself. And so we were playing a lot of really comfort comps. Like we played basically 1 or 2 comps at the start of the split. And in that time, we were trying to fix these issues. And as these issues got fixed, we were kind of behind other teams in terms of mid and late game play, because every other team in Europe plays like, both NA and EU have this, where teams play just to scale and kind of survive early on. And not many teams in Europe have good early game macro. And while that was our strength, these teams have been practicing mid-late game for so long because no one contested them for early game, that regardless of our lead, when we get to mid and late game, we were kind of behind every other team in that sense.
Okay. Because that is what obviously one of the bizarre things is. There's very different types of records. Like, just because you had a losing record, well, the bizarre part is, okay, so in some leagues you could have a losing record and then, the only wins you got were the teams below you in the table. But people might remember, first of all, early in the split, when some of the teams, like obviously Vitality was doing really well, well, you were one of the teams that actually beat Vitality. And then obviously you had wins over Fnatic, who looked like they're poised to maybe win the title. So what were the ups of the team? What was the team at its best at?
We're actually really good at playing other teams that like to play like us. And Fnatic is one of those. Even though they play different comps than we do, we tend to be way more early game oriented than probably any team in Europe right now. Fnatic is like the opposite. For a lot of the split, Fnatic played late game, and they were just really good at team fighting, and good enough, or like really good players in laning phase. So even though their early game wasn't good, they could still survive against pretty much every team. And so in that sense, there was a stylistic difference between us, but our approach to the game itself was pretty similar in terms of how we want to play mid-late game, when we want to look for fights, etc. And when we play these teams, it's a lot easier for both teams to read the other. Like, it's really easy for us to read what Fnatic wants to do. And I assume that it's easy for Fnatic to read when we want to make plays or when we want to look for a fight. So those games make a lot more sense to us. And I think as players and as a team, we're a lot more comfortable in those games where both teams are kind of playing a lot more standard. But when we play against like teams below us, or the teams that should be below us, they, like Giants Gaming, for example, I don't think Giants was ever that good in Spring Split, but they played the exact same type of comp every single time, and which is just pure late game with Caitlyn, for example. And if you want to beat a comp like that, you can either try to draft an even later, an even better scaling comp, which is not something that we're really comfortable with, or you can try to beat them in early game and actually snowball correctly. And we always took the approach of trying to beat them early game and snowball correctly. But if you make a mistake on that sense, then it doesn't matter how good or bad a team is. If they have a late game scaling comp and they don't get snowballed on, they're going to outscale you. And most of our losses to like teams below us are more often than not us just getting outscaled. I think the only team that straight up beat us like from early to mid to late was Roccat, and if I remember correctly, H2K Game 2. But I don't remember if I think that was even, and then that was an Rise game, right?
Yeah.
So I think we had winning conditions there too. I think Rockat's the only team that's completely stomped us like early, mid, late. But outside of that, we've never been in a position where we shouldn't win. But we make a lot of mistakes either individually, or we don't know how to look for proactive plays, or like there's just like come mid game, there's no cohesion within the team, and that's where like the comps we like to play get broken down. That's also why I think we were wrong in the direction we just took with that team. Like in hindsight, we should have taken the direction that I guess Fnatic did, which is just play late game, get some wins on the board, and just learn mid late, and then you can fix early game later. But from my perception, our early game was already so strong that I wanted to go the other way of learning how to play mid game correctly with a lead, as opposed to getting to mid game even or behind slightly because the other team is better early, but then just being better at that point.
What do you think on that, Kelsey, on that like somewhat abstract metagame concept?
I understand breaking the game down into like early, mid, and late and shorthand, but whenever you look at a comp, you have to be able to know how to execute it like at all stages of the game, and how you execute something in late game always, in my head, informs how you're going to play early. And how the enemy team is going to execute their late game always informs how they're going to play early. So it's finding like the intersection of that it becomes your early game plan. So for me, it's always been really weird to break the game down into like, we only focus on early, mid, or later, or things like this. Like, I understand obviously if you're drafting an early heavy focus comp, you want to focus a lot more on trying to snowball, but you still need to have a plan on like how to carry out and how to close it out. So for me, it's just like super weird to put it into those terms, but I agree that you had a lot of difficulty finding ways to engage or start fights, and it seemed to me that you were relying a lot on Maxlore to do that, but it was like imperfect in a lot of ways because he was also playing like these super aggressive champs that might not necessarily, that are good at ganking early, but might not necessarily be the best tools for engaging later. And like you had an uptick very briefly in the middle of the split where you're like, we're going to play Shen. So when Maxlore goes in, you have Shen, and then it's like, okay, he's safe, it's fine. But then like you take the Shen away and it seemed like you didn't have an answer after that.
See, what's great is you could actually come up with a catchy name for what you just proposed there, Kelsey. It could be like the Kelsey Moser game intersectionality critical theory, because it's not just about the stage of the game, it's also about what your comp is, but then who is your player as well? Are they capable of playing that champion? So those three things, how they intersect, actually, it's a better way to sort of critically view the game, isn't it? So I knew intersectionality would get to you eventually, Kelsey. I was just waiting until when. No, anyway, going back to that though, what did you think of her theory then about Maxlore?
I agree. Like Maxlore is our best player in terms of understanding when we should look for a fight and then actually forcing it. And so in that sense, it always made sense to put him on a tank. But then the issue was if Maxlore's on a tank and the other team also has a tank. So for example, when we play, if we play Splyce, Cersei is most comfortable on tanks, or in my opinion, Splyce functions best when he's on a tank. And if we put him on a tank against Splyce, well, then we're kind of in this weird phase where a lot of the reason we get the advantages we do get is because of the champions Maxlore is on, and he's very good at understanding his jungle matchups and how to get a lead from that. Like if he has a faster tempo jungler, he'll understand that you either get dragon from it, or you get 2 camp advantage, or you get first gank off, or you keep that tempo for something else. So like he understands these concepts very well. And so in that sense, putting a lot of playmaking for early game on him made sense. But at the same time, if he is on a tank, then come mid-late game, we'll have more options for engage, or rather better suited options for our team for engage. But we wouldn't have the same advantages early game, which is how we're used to playing the game. So like that's what I meant by like we took one direction, which is to always have Nubar on or Maxlore on a champion where he can get us an early lead, because we would know how to play our matchups. So we would have 1 or 2 lanes of good matchups, and we just trust Maxlore on that side of the map to know what to do with it. And we would get these leads where we could have taken, because a lot of other teams took the other approach, which is have their jungle on a tank, just have a very easy, jungle on tank is always a very easy comp to play. So just go with that direction. You'll always have someone reliable for mid-game or late-game engages, or even early-game skirmishes if you want, but you won't have the same tempo advantages in early game. And we like, I think as a team and as players, we're very comfortable playing with tempo. Mm-hmm. We just need, unlike the previous roster, we don't have the same versatility in terms of finding plays or proactivity or playmaking. Like the point you made about, it's not just early, mid, late. I completely agree with that. But there's like these points where if you have like a comp that's more suited for early game skirmishes and they have something that just wants to scale and catch waves and snowball, then there's going to be a point where your comp needs to force a fight and snowball their item advantage or power spike or whatever it may be. And come that point, we either wouldn't recognize it, or we would recognize it, but we wouldn't know how to really push it. And I don't think us necessarily having Maxlore on an engaged champion would have changed that too much. We would have picked up more wins against lower tier teams for sure if we played it that way, because it's just a safer style to play. But at the same time, we probably wouldn't be as good against the top teams who do tend to abuse early game more.
Okay, well, that's, if you say that then, right, okay, obviously in the context of you wish the team made the playoffs and therefore could have seen what would happen in, best of fives, etc. Okay, I can acknowledge that, but it sounds like you were trying to build the case that you should have done that, but isn't the approach you took actually the better approach long-term to try and have a better team?
Yeah, it is. It's the better approach long-term and the worse approach short-term, because, and that's where like best of 1 versus best of 3s changes a lot of things. In a best of 3, you can always try to like play the style and then recognize that it's not working. Like if you look at our record in regular season for in the past year, it still wasn't that great. And we in middle of the split, we always had a dip. But that's generally because we would play these type of comps, and it would take us a long time to figure something out, and then we either failed or succeeded at trying to learn the concept we're trying to pick up. And last year we succeeded in picking up the concepts by playoffs, but we never made playoffs as a top team. We always came in as 5th or 6th place. And I think that like this split, in terms of our trajectory, was no different than last year. We had a decent early game, we were okay mid, and then come end of the split, we took a dip, which is what Misfits has been the last 2 splits as well. But the difference that I fail to recognize is that in a best of 3, if you recognize that your early game comp against a certain team isn't working, you can easily transition to a more mid or late game comp for the next 2 games, and you'll probably still pick up wins, because within that first game, you recognize how they're playing early game and what their weaknesses might be, or what their understanding of early game is, where in a best of 1, you only have 1 chance. And in that sense, it's always safer to just play scaling if you just want to, I guess, have like less risk in terms of picking up split wins. And we kind of we didn't respect enough how much split wins matter, the split, because we never really have had to, because you can always, previously we've always adapted within a best of, and that's not an excuse in terms of this is a best of 1 versus we would do better in a best of 5. That's just, the reality is that other teams in Europe recognized how they should approach best of 1, and like me and us as a staff failed to do that. And we decided to take the more long-term approach for building a team, but we weren't good enough short-term to actually make that a viable option in terms of like the split.
So I have a couple of questions. One is, so like sometimes when you talk about having like focusing on getting really good snowball options early, I felt like there were a couple of drafts where like that was your only way to play it out, and you didn't have like spikes in other phases of the game, like mid or late or anything like this. So my question is kind of like, do you see that as a really good way to play, is to just like only draft an early game focus comp? And then the second question will come to me while you're answering that one.
I don't think that's like the best way to play or the only way to play, but I think we have really strong laners in like pretty much all 3 lanes, and we have a jungler that understands early game tempo. Like, I'd be confident to say that Max is the best jungler in Europe at understanding early game tempo, and that it just makes sense then to try to make your team or try to give your team tools where like 3 or 4 people have the ability to snowball from their position in early game. I don't necessarily think it's like the best way to play, but I personally like, I guess on a more broader sense, I like to play the game that way. I like to be the team that tries to push for more advantages and take more risks, but with high rewards. If you look at a lot of King Zone comps, a lot of them tend to be 4 or 5 damage dealers, or 4 damage dealers rather. And I think we tried to emulate that, where you have other teams like SKT, or even, well, I guess Samsung's like the extreme version, where they still try to have a more stable comp. But if a comp with like where everyone has the option to make early game plays does so and doesn't make mistakes in terms of execution, then I think that comp will always win. But the room for not making mistakes is so much wider, where if you make a single mistake, the punish for that is so much worse than it would be if you have a tank jungler or a tank top, that we aren't good enough to execute that. And then also in a best of 1, it doesn't necessarily make sense to go that route.
And
if the goal is to win the split.
And obviously, having multiple damage dealers doesn't necessarily mean you can't play. It isn't a late game comp, right?
Yeah.
So I was more like referring to.
I completely agree. I think a lot of people have the perception where like, you have if you have Sejuani versus Kha'Zix jungle come late game, the Sejuani team is just going to have a much better time because they can force engages, blah, blah. Like this argument exists more so in the West, I think, because again, King Zone is like the perfect example of a team that King Zone, Rocks, Tigers previously, when they had the 2016 roster, etc. Like there's been teams in Korea that have proven that that's not the case. You can play both sides of it, and both sides of it are fine late game. It's just about execution at that point.
And the second question I had was, I would kind of like to see you answer the criticisms that Tsenkov received all split. I would like to see your take on that, because you mentioned in that explanation that you feel like you have 3 very strong laners, right? So I was curious how you would answer that.
So if you, people can't see this from the outside. Like, for one, Tsenkov got a lot of criticism because early on in the split, especially the first 3 weeks, he didn't play well. And he played really poorly, and that kind of stuck in everyone's head. So now he has to redeem himself from that position for the rest of the split. And I don't think he necessarily did, but I don't think he played bad after those first 3 weeks. I think he was probably our more consistent player. I don't think he was winning or losing lane at any point. He was going even. He was just playing his matchup the way he's meant to. He found a lot of good roams, and when he was on champions that have engage or either engage or CC, or just champions that can force skirmishes a lot, he was more often than not the person that forced these skirmishes. So what people didn't see is that, like, they gave a lot of criticism to Tsenkov, but he was also one of our better playmakers and improved week to week in that aspect. So I think he got way too much hate from the community in that sense. Like, if the argument is, was he a top 3 mid laner in Europe, that's a different story. If the argument is that he's like a bottom 3 mid laner and should be replaced, I don't think so, because he has been our most consistent, in people's efforts to look for every single flaw in his play, they've completely ignored the flaws in everyone else's play. Like, the other 4 players have gotten away with so many mistakes, or like individual or macro mistakes from their end, because everyone's kind of focused on Tsenkov. Where if he has a lead from mid lane, it wouldn't get snowballed, because come mid game, the people with engage wouldn't find engages, or there were like game 2 against Roccat, for example, like Cress is playing his lane really well, and then Nubar goes for an invade that he shouldn't, and that messes with his lane. So like, there's a lot of nuances to mid lane that kind of get missed by people. He gave up waves to get bot lane ahead a lot of times, so then he receives criticism for not snowballing the game when his champion is a roaming champion that did what he's supposed to do and roamed and got another lane ahead, and we didn't win that game. Like, the criticism should be on the people with the lead for a failure to snowball than on like the utility player. And for a lot of the split, Crest was kind of on utility for us. That's
sure.
My view on it.
Obviously, that's the problem with trying to critique players individually, though, isn't it? Instead of as a team, which is always going to be a trap people fall into, sadly. Right, okay, let's do the other side of the equation then. Since H2K did actually make the playoffs, despite, again, I'll reiterate, having the same record, 8-10, but to be fair, 7 of those wins did come on like the back part of the split, so not bad. Went into the playoffs hot. What's your take, Hussain? What was H2K like this split? Obviously, it does help to be able to literally change like half the fucking team to better players, but, you know.
Actually, I respect that they changed the players, because it really wasn't working for them at the start, the initial roster. As for, like, I'll only talk about the games with the new roster, because those are the only games that mattered. They did well with that roster, and I think their early game was still whatever, but in Europe, that doesn't necessarily matter too much. And come mid-late game, I think what H2K's strengths were in team fighting, especially like Sheriff is, I think he's been an outstanding rookie for his first split. So I don't think H2K excels at anything yet, but their team fighting is solid. They draft comms that tend to help them in terms of team fighting. And then they have these weird comms every now and then where they try to play 1-3-1. Sometimes it works out for them, sometimes it doesn't. And also, a lot of their victories aren't necessarily on the back of H2K. Like, the Vitality series, for example, a lot of it was just like Baron throw after Baron throw from both teams, or more so in Vitality or in H2K's favor, I guess, but still. And even in the regular season, there were a lot of victories that H2K picked up where they were really far behind early game. Like the game against Roccat that got them to qualification, they probably should have lost that game. And I think there's been multiple instances towards the back half of the split where they got wins that they probably shouldn't have, and I don't think they necessarily showed that they're a great team in the Vitality series either.
Okay, right, Kelsey. H2K's early game is W/E. Response
is W for yeah. Yeah. I think
all right.
the best description that I agree with the most that I heard from any commentator or something like this was the Spanish scene. when we had him on the episode once, the Cabra. So I'm just going to steal what he said, which is that it feels like H2K go into every game with a clear game plan and then someone ints. And I would say that that's like a pretty accurate description of how our early game goes. It's kind of a work in progress. I think we did fix a lot of stuff. There's still a lot of things that we're working on, but we have plans to kind of work on that. So I'm not too worried. Yeah, so that's the answer.
Because here's the weird thing about that, okay, right? I realize when I give this analogy now, as with everyone who is a low attention span idiot from the 21st century, every kid just goes, that analogy doesn't work because it's not identical. But just listen to the point of the analogy that I'm bringing up. So there's actually a famous thing where supposedly in chess, loads of people who are like amateur chess players never get past a very basic level because they just get obsessed by the idea of trying to master the openings in chess because they think, you know, understandably if you're a beginner, but if I have the first few moves down and I get an advantage there, I'm going to win, aren't I? But what they don't realize is, I've heard, I'm not claiming to be a chess expert, that actually the best way to teach people chess is the opposite way. You start with the end game scenarios, which basically are like the fundamentals, because you've only got a few pieces and you have to make the correct decisions and plan out your moves, and you work your way backwards. And yes, obviously you want to keep up to date on what to do in the opening, but you would never put all your focus into that. I mean, if you think about it, it's actually, as much as it's counterintuitive initially, it becomes completely intuitive, because what would the use of having the best opening be if then you didn't know what to do with it in the mid to late? You wouldn't be able to ever close a game, which would be actually probably the worst scenario to be in. So in this scenario where both of you have basically come from opposite ends of the spectrum on this, how much effort should people put in to having like a really strong opening, and how much should they tunnel on these aspects? You can't spread your attention equally on all aspects of the game, right?
I don't think so. I think generally when a roster is formed, there's like certain strengths that the players bring, and that might be laning phase, or that might be communication, or that might be their ability to force fights, or it could be any variety of things. And once you recognize what those strengths are, then you kind of figure out where you can use them best for immediate results. And that's probably the best. Like from there, there's like two ways you can go about it. So say, like I'll use Misfits as an example. We have a strong early game and strong laning phases. So the approach I took was trying to learn through our strengths rather than our weaknesses. And the other argument, which is the direction that we should have gone, is learning from our weaknesses. So learning team cohesion and coordination way more than how to snowball early game better. And I don't think it's necessarily like learning one or the other. It's just figuring out where your team currently stands and then figuring out what they need to work on. Because the other side of the argument is you could have veterans that maybe don't have the best laning phase, but they have really good understanding of map play overall. And so to them, it's just keeping them up to date with whatever the newest meta is for early game, or whatever new jungle pathings come up, or how tempo changes over patches, et cetera, et cetera. So it really just depends on the strength of the initial team.
Okay. Was there a philosophy in H2K on what you were doing in that sense, Kelsey? I mean, I know in theory, obviously, you try to inform people on all aspects of the game, but not everything's going to stick. You have to put more effort certain places, right?
It's kind of funny that you bring that up, though, because that you should teach closing scenarios first, because we definitely focus on early game stuff in our review way more, because obviously that's where our biggest problems are. Okay. So I feel like we almost had the opposite approach, where it's like we're going to address the problems that are our biggest problems, and then like we've worked out from there for sure. And there was stuff that was like they just understood and that they came up with and everything else. But it's like, yeah, I think we probably have a different approach where we focus more on where we're weak than Misfits does, from what he said. So.
Okay. Right. Well, Hussain, I actually have forgotten now. How did you characterize it? Because the thing is, you had like a sentence, and because in the first part of the sentence, you like threw a little bit of shade where you were like, they should have lost to Roccat. Then I forget how you characterized the Vitality series. Did you say you were underwhelmed by the H2K Vitality series?
Oh yeah, I thought it was pretty terrible from both ends, because like in I think 4 out of the 5 games, Vitality had the first lead, And then, except for I don't remember if game 1 had a Baron steal, but the other game 2, game 3, and game 5 where Vitality had a lead, they then threw the lead, so then H2K got it, and then H2K either snowballed it or they threw the lead back and then Vitality got it. But in 4 of the 5 games, Vitality was much better in the early game, and the game they weren't, they, in my opinion, hardened to draft. The game 4 where they first picked Tahm Kench instead of the Caitlyn, I think they really gave themselves almost no options in early game to play the game. And so in that sense, I was underwhelmed by Vitality because, I mean, people have been talking about their Baron control for weeks now, and it still doesn't seem to have been fixed. And then on the other hand, with H2K, because the games were close, not so much because H2K was creating their own advantages, but rather because they either got a Baron steal or in some cases, they legitimately did a good job of punishing Vitality for being out of position. But regardless, they didn't necessarily create their own advantages from the get-go. They relied more on Vitality kind of giving away a 2 or 3K goal lead.
I mean, I guess this is open for me to respond. Yeah. The way that I feel is that it's not, it's in the setup phase where Vitality have the most problems in terms of like their mid to late Baron setup, and I think that that's something that, like, you talk about our team fighting, I think our setups for mid to late are actually like what makes us strong. Not necessarily just opportunistically doing fights or whatever, but like our setups are actually really good. So I think that's sort of what happened. It's really difficult to talk about like some of the stuff that happened in those games because obviously like these are issues that we're still working on, but I definitely agree that like this was a hard series because all of the players at the end felt like they lost rather than Vitality won, you know? But I feel like Vitality probably would have the same feeling if it had gone the other way.
Lost. Yeah,
if they had lost. Because there were definitely both teams like gave up opportunities too easily. So I I do think that this was like a really underwhelming series from both perspectives. So yeah.
Yeah, I also think in that sense, like you got to see, like the one thing you got to see for both teams was a lot of moments where both teams had a chance to snowball their lead. And in that sense, I think H2K did a better job over the series than Vitality did. Mostly because of Vitality's Baron setups, they just don't seem coordinated on that. They just don't understand like how waves should be pushed for it, or where they should place vision for it, or how to kind of predict enemy movement or how to react to it. Their Baron play just seems to be go start Baron and then hope it doesn't get stolen, or come down to have it come down to 1500 and then it's just like 50-50. I think the game 5 was even like it really did. Game 4, one of the games came down to like a pure 50-50 where Vitality had everything. They had 2 inhibs and Baron was up, and that should be Vitality Baron every single time. And yet that Baron came down to a 50-50, which to me was like, I was more disappointed in Vitality than H2K in that series for sure, because H2K's issues didn't seem anything different from regular season, which is their early game was always an issue, but their mid-late game at least still seemed better. When you guys had a lead, it still seemed to make sense how you were trying to snowball it. With Vitality, it was the same thing that it's been the whole split, but nothing improved. They've always been good at, if they get an early lead, they're always good at going from an early game lead to a decent mid-game advantage. And then 20 minutes comes around, Baron spawns, and then they just seem like headless chickens. And every single Vitality game is identical. Either they lose early game and then they get snowballed on, or they win early game and then it's a 50-50 at Baron whether they win or lose. So it was, even though Vitality won, Vitality was by far the more disappointing team just because their issue, in my mind, seems simpler to fix. Where I think, personally, I think early game is a lot harder to learn and like a lot more rewarding over time, but there's so many factors to it that it definitely takes a longer time to learn how to play early game better.
Sure. Okay.
What do you think, Hussain, of H2K playing Kassadin in the 4th and 5th game? Not a champion we've seen used actually much this split at all. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think game 5 they even blind picked it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And game 4 was against Vladimir. Actually, I liked it in game 4. That Vlad blind was kind of weird. Yeah. So I actually liked the cast in that game. For blind pick, so it was kind of weird because they have Zac and Ornn, so they already have really good engage, and then you had first pick Tahm Kench, and Braum is open, so we can assume, like Vitality did, that they're going to take Braum eventually. So I think Ornn against Braum is fine if there are ways to bait out Braum Shield. But it didn't feel like there was any way for you to ever bait out Braum Shield in this comp. And because it's Ashe, Kassadin, Zac, Tahm Kench, Ornn. So I felt like Braum could always save his shield for Ornn. That means one engage is gone, and then it's really just on Zac to engage, which isn't the easiest thing to do when it's against a Trundle comp as well, a Trundle Braum comp. So I thought in game 5, the Kassadin was kind of like it can work. Maybe you knew something about Jizuke's champion pool, which made the blind pick okay. I'm assuming that's what it was. And so it can work, but it was still strange to see Ornn prioritized so highly, knowing Braum is open without drafting any way to bait out the Braum shield. I think that was the only criticism for that comp. The Kassadin itself was fine, but I feel like if you guys want to do that, then maybe there should be something in the second rotation that either punishes Braum for not using his shield or baits it out.
So, since Veteran tweeted it the other day or whatever, I feel like I could talk about this and it doesn't matter. But like our opinion is kind of like Braum countering Ornn is a bit of a meme because Braum is going to use his shield against engage, and then he's not going to be able to protect the carries against like actual damage or anything like that, like Ashe or whatever. So I think like for us, we don't necessarily think Braum is like a huge counter to Ornn. And then the Kassadin pick, like, yeah, if we're just planning to 5v5 all the time, it's a big problem. But the thing about Kassadin is like super good side laning champion. Like it doesn't really lose to anyone after level 11. Yeah. So
I don't think your comp can't work, but I don't like it. So you have Kassadin, which means you want to 4-1 or 1-3-1. And then on the Ornn Braum interaction, I agree. But in this comp, you're not going to outrange enemy team comp. Like Ashe is not going to outrange Tristana except for like a small portion of the game. So it's not like when Braum uses shield that you can necessarily go after the carries either. And so that's the part where it was kind of weird, because I thought maybe you would draft like something more long range so that if Braum uses shield, then you can actually go on the carries. But it's already pretty hard to get on Tristana, and then like the longer the game goes, the more she's going to outrange you as well. So you can't just walk up to her and just you're only engaged at that point after Ornn uses ult or the only way to get on the carries seems to be Zac. But I think if Zac jumps in, he probably just dies, to be honest.
I mean,
frontal, Braum, Tristana.
Like this was the really disappointing game where I felt like we almost won anyway.
Yeah.
But there was like the one unfortunate dive from the Zac. But
I mean, the fights were still close. I don't think they should have been that close, but because I think Braum was misplaying a little bit as well in the team fights. But if you want to play 4-1, then like that's fine as well. I think you can win fights if Kassadin's on a flank, because if once Braum shield is used, then he can just go on Tristana. But almost none of the fights Kassadin had Kassadin on a flank either. So he was trying to get on Tristana from the front, which also like your comp can work if you execute it correctly. It's hard to execute, but it definitely can work. But then like the execution wasn't done properly either.
Yeah, I agree. There were execution issues throughout the entire series for sure. But yeah, Kelsey, I don't necessarily think the comp was bad.
It's obviously a preoccupation of yours to play around side lanes, right? It's like the way that you automatically break down every team.
Yeah.
It's the way you say that. But isn't that also one of the most difficult things to get pro teams to actually do correctly? And even if you sort of set them up, they're like toddlers that like you look away from for a minute. They're 5v5 again. I thought we said side laning. Remember the whiteboard? Remember I was drawing things, and why are we fighting it? Isn't it tough to get people to play that way? Listen, I agree. Like it's the same concept as like the abstract concept that's existed for years of like, don't just unnecessarily go for 50-50 Barons while ahead, but teams still fucking do it every time, because obviously in the game they think differently than you would in an abstract distance sense. So what's the challenge there in that sense? Because it's clearly something you care about a lot, right? You see it as a way to win the game.
Maybe this is my version of Hussein's like early game is really awarding thing, you know?
Okay.
So I think like in game 2, for example, we demonstrated that we can like execute this kind of comp. Obviously there were issues, and a lot of the issues were just like, Camille, go in, kill it. But because like I dislike the idea that sideline comps are really difficult to execute, because I think like, for example, if you look at this game, right, as long as you get Camille ahead and you transition Camille to, like, this is the game 2, we had the Camille pick. As long as you get the Camille ahead and you transition Camille to the bot side of the map within a reasonable time frame, you're going to have like the first 2 turrets gone by the time Baron spawns, right? Like Camille gets 2 items, whatever. And then at that point, it's, even if the enemy team wants to engage with their Shen or whatever, it becomes a choice between them losing their base and forcing something in the mid lane, or them losing their base because Camille is wrecking the Shen like super hard anyway. So I don't know.
That is also how you always present it. Like whenever you talk about the comp, you're always like, but if you do that, then you lose all your base. Like,
you lose your base.
Here's the thing, Kelsey, you'd be one of the best Yu-Gi-Oh players of all time. The problem is, in this scenario, the cards have a mind of their own and they play themselves. So you'd be killing it. You'd be trapping them all the time. Oh, now you lose your base. But in the real world, they don't always do it. That's the problem.
I mean, it can definitely be done. And I think that there's a reason why Camille is so effective in EU, is because that's probably the easiest champion to do this kind of thing with right now. But
she's also strong in team fighting, so like because I think all Western teams have this issue, like regardless of the type of comp they play, whether they're ahead, whether they're behind, it'll eventually come down to we must 5v5, march on. So when you have these champions in top lane that can carry and also team fight well, like it's always going to do really well in Europe, because we've got really good top laners who like to play these lane dominant champions, or rather like these carry champions. And Camille's probably the perfect champion, where she's really good at team fighting, she's really good at scaling, she's got a decent laning phase, she's one of the best split pushers. Like, she is the perfect European champion for top of lane.
I also think Kassadin kind of fits into this as well, because Kassadin can definitely team fight. Kassadin can definitely sideline really well. So like theoretically, if you get champions that are super good at this, like it shouldn't be that difficult to execute relative to just like group mid and go super hard 5v5 all the time. Because at a point, I feel like when you have these 5v5 comps, and then someone like in NA, we saw, okay, we first picked Caitlyn. All right, we just won the 5v5 draft. Let's go. We win the game, guys. It's over now. Like, if there's going to be an objectively better team fighting comp that's drafted, right? Like, if you're opting into these 5v5s, one team is just going to be objectively better at that. So unless you have an answer to that or something to do instead, or like whether it's snowballing or something and getting to a point where you don't have to 5v5 with the disadvantage and on even ground, whether it's like setting up a really good sideline draft where you have something you can do in mid to late game that isn't team fighting. I think that there has to be something that you're doing with your draft if you see the enemy team going for like a super good 5v5 comp. So.
Right. As we transition to move on about the other playoff teams, I did have one abstract meta question to ask you, Hussain, for your opinion. We touched on it on a different show, but basically the question is this. Like, why in EU do I never see Azir picked and it's just like permaban status? Because when I go and watch the LCK to do my show with Emily, or even if I watch like the top LPL teams, I'm going to see Azir all over the place. So why is EU just refusing to play this champion, but still banning it, therefore somehow acknowledging that it's clearly really strong? Is that like a gentleman's agreement or something?
I think, I don't know, Europe, this split was super weird because everyone... like over half the teams wanted to play pure late game without any shot of getting anything in early game, and they were still winning those games. And that's where like Azir was played a lot like early on in Europe for that reason. And then people started banning Azir against like certain teams like Giants just because they relied on this champion in mid lane, where Azir in early game can be abused a lot, but he will always farm up and he'll always be useful mid late. It's really hard to take tower against Azir, and if Azir ever gets first tower, then it's like he has an insane amount of map control. So those are his strengths, but his abuse window is early into mid and 1-3-1. And Europe doesn't seem comfortable playing 1-3-1 or isn't good at it. And they don't really care to play early game that much. And so Azir just seems OP, which leads to ban status. And then since it's banned so much, no one wants to play it. Also, European teams are trying to figure out other ways to play so they don't spend too much time in scrims with Azir. So it's just like snowball effect where Azir's OP, so we ban it. Okay, now we want to learn how to play against it. So we never played in scrims. Okay, well now we don't feel comfortable playing it, but they might, so we ban it. And so it just ends up being perma-ban. Also, I don't know if LCS played on 8... Wait, has LCS playoffs or 8.5 as well, right?
Yeah, they're on 8.6. They played 8.5 in regular season, though. Yeah. I think... So for me, the thing about Azir, besides like the stuff that you said, is that he gets mid-prio very easily. Even in like matchups that are counter matchups, he still can get mid-prio pretty easily. And then, so that's problematic. And teams really love forcing mid in Europe. Like it's been, get advantage of bot lane and go mid all the time. Like almost every team does this. And it's kind of hard to gank Azir. So I think that those are some of the reasons why it just seems like really strong in the EU meta at every phase of the game, so people just ban it.
He's basically the new Orianna. Like, he can work in most comms, and there's windows to punish him, but he's always going to be strong in the game, pretty much no matter what. So if you just want to play a really safe style, Azir's the best mid lane champion for that.
Okay. Right, let's carry on the Vitality thread then. So obviously Vitality went through, played Fnatic. Fnatic didn't have Soaz due to this bizarre freak situation where he's busted his hand up and they had to play with Bwipo instead. Does the fact that Vitality couldn't beat a team without what probably was the MVP last year, does this say something about Vitality overall?
I never respected Vitality that much in the split. Or I don't think many teams saw them as a big threat. I think their record made them look better than they were. So I don't know if it says much about Vitality. I don't think anything about the series was surprising. Their series against H2K pretty much showed what Vitality's level is at. And it wasn't very good then. It wasn't good for most of the second half of the split. So
when you say that though, that their record made them look better than they were, right? What changed to make them no longer a team capable of having a record like that?
Oh, their first half of the split was just Gilius hits level 2, level 3, level 4, and goes mid, and every single chance possible. He'll have his whole camps up for 2-3 minutes, and he'll just be sitting in a mid bush. It was very easy to punish mid lane in Europe because no one does this, and so it just worked out for them. And then teams figured out that Vitality just loves to cheese gank mid, so they started playing correctly. And then Vitality, it seemed like they tried to fix it and they tried to play a little bit more standard. Gilly still has his weird pathings and weird level 3 play. He did it twice, I think in game 1 and game 2 against in your series, top lane. He still has these weird pathings that he does, and now he's changing which lane he does it in. But if you kind of predict that, and if you play a proper farm game against Gilius, then it's pretty much the only playbook Vitality has for most of the game. And then after that, they're just going to try to find random fights on you.
Yeah, I think also with us, it's every team probably thinks, oh, we can just gank Smitty.
Yeah.
It's fine.
I can understand why they tried it. I don't blame them for trying it.
But I think, that's kind of the... Yeah, for me, I really agree. Our approach to Vitality was, in the regular season, was have a strong bot lane 2v2 and then bot lane camera mid and whatever, which worked really well in that situation. So it was there were so many answers to Vitality and so many ways to play against Vitality. And their second half was 3-7 relative to our 7-3. So we also went into the series not really thinking that they were super, super strong. Obviously, neither are we, but it ended up being Vitality. So I didn't necessarily expect them to do a lot. I thought that there were certain things about Vitality that could have made them a good matchup against Fnatic, especially without Soaz. There were some things that they But instead, I think they took like the approach of trying to get Cabochard ahead because they thought they could abuse Bwipo, which I thought was like really one-dimensional and not very good. So instead of taking like where I saw them match up fairly well, which is that they don't necessarily, Fnatic aren't always very good at protecting their mid lane. They didn't really abuse that, so it was really an underwhelming series overall.
I thought it was over just from the bot lane matchup. Like Vitality, when they have a winning 2v2, it still doesn't feel that oppressive. It still doesn't feel like you're going to get punished for it. Maybe that's because of the way Gillies plays the game, but I also think the 2v2 in lane is lacking. So I like the approach Fnatic took with like going for Ezreal, going for something that had 1 or 2 items, is very, very abusive, had a safe laning phase, and like they just get to 1 or 2 items, and then if Vitality doesn't have a huge lead, it's really easy to force fights on Vitality because they'll just give you fights, because that's just the way they know how to play the game if they're not ahead. So I thought Fnatic had a really smart plan against them, and I don't know, I think Fnatic's 2v2 is probably, in terms of laning phase, I think us and Fnatic had the best 2v2, and I think they were way too heavily mismatched there against Vitality.
Okay. Right, on the other side of the bracket, like one of the teams which, when their roster was announced, everyone pretty wrote off was Roccat. And then when we had Fly on the Shore, like I actually just did the fully legit, unbiased reckon of him, where I just basically just mocked, like, you know, all the language of like, we're developing players and taking a chance. So it's like, so you didn't have any money and you couldn't get any good players. Okay, got it. Right. Kelsey, on the other hand, just, I don't know what it is. Something just rubbed her the wrong way, you know. She was just in one of those moods and she just tore them apart. Like, you know, I mean, listen, understandably so. Some of the players in the team, obviously, like the Koreans, I mean, these were considered players where it's like almost a meme that if your team signs them, like, you literally just want people with a Korean flag. That was almost the expectation. But as people can tell by the fact they made the playoffs and obviously beat, for example, Misfits, etc., they did kind of actually turn out to be a half-decent team, right? So what were the positives of this team?
Memento.
Pretty good, right? Listen, having a jungler as a start already.
Like, Memento is the closest jungler to Maxlore in Europe, and I'm pretty sure he's like 80% of Roccat's success. I think if Roccat has any good map plays, it's always Memento calling it. More often than not, he's like the playmaker, that the one that's forcing all the plays on Roccat. His early game is pretty good. I think he's probably had his best split, and I think he's like single-handedly the biggest factor for Roccat being in playoffs.
And a lot of the stuff that people praise Roccat for, and some of it is like legitimately good, and some of it is maybe they overdo it a bit, is like the warding and stuff. And that's just because Memento is really, really kind of like autistic about warding. And I mean, by that, I mean super detail oriented, excuse me. Like he's super detail oriented when it comes to pink wards and stuff like this. So like, I think that a lot of people talked about Freddy as the master of pink wards, but knowing that Memento is really fixated on that kind of thing, it probably was at least a joint project. Also, like, I think Norscairn is really strong, and their synergy as a duo, like they were strong together on Schalke, and they wanted to play together, to my understanding, as well. So, like, as a duo, I think having a support jungle duo is really underrated, especially considering in Europe how much emphasis people put on controlling bottom side river. Like, given that, I think the best thing that you can have is a support jungle duo that are really in sync and that have a strong jungle support matchup. Because then you almost always have control of bot side river, and I think that they were really good at that. So I would say that like that duo made that team as strong as they were. So yeah.
What do you make of the two Koreans then? Because I know at times, partly because, you know, it was so unexpected some of the games that they won, I saw times where people were doing that classic thing where they were like, no wonder Profit was part of SK Telecom in some vague way, like they do with every player, like in LPL, for example, it used to be in SK Telecom. But then, I'll admit, I didn't watch that many Roccat games. And when I watched that quarterfinal, that was fucking garbage. He was terrible. So what do you make of the Koreans overall? What, like, did they actually, did one of them impress more than the other? Are they legit players overall? What do you think?
I think they were okay. I don't think any of them really impressed. Like, they weren't just straight up bad, but they weren't Like, they didn't offer anything special.
Like, in the context of, if you have them, they're import slots. So logically, you want them to be better than European players, right?
I don't think so. I think I don't think they're better than any, like... I think there's people in European Challenger or Masters, I think it's called now, that would be better than them. Maybe not right away, just because of, like, just basic game knowledge, but within a few weeks of practice, I think there's a lot of people in European Challenger that would be better than either of them. So yeah. I don't think they deserve, like, taking up 2 import slots for sure.
Yep, I agree.
And, like, I think Prophet always gets exposed when he's against top laners that actually have a good laning phase. I think that's what happened against Splyce. It's hard to say about us because we got stomped by Roccat both times, and I think a lot of that was from Memento. So I don't know. Like, it's hard for me to say, like, much about Roccat outside of I'm really impressed by Memento, because I don't think any of their laners necessarily impressed that much. And yeah, like the synergy between Norskeren and Memento, like, you can clearly see, because when Roccat does have a lead, it does feel quite punishing in terms of how black the map gets and how you have to try to come back, because they do a lot of steps in terms of vision that we like to do when we're, or like rather that we want to do when we're ahead, that we used to do like before. And there's very little counterplay to it if you don't punish it correctly. So Roccat ends up kind of being a kryptonite for us in that sense, because if they're the only team that, and probably because of Memento, that we don't just straight up get early game leads against. And with that said, then the windows where you have to punish them, like I said, we're pretty bad recognizing those windows. So Roccat always seemed really strong against us, and the only reason I could think of for that was Memento and Norskeren in terms of vision later on.
In that series, the Splyce series, does the fact that Splyce eventually did just put Odoamne on Camille all the time and he did just body, is that them just identifying that this was a mismatch? Because I have to say, when we had Odoamne on the show on an earlier episode, it did make me lose all hope, where he just sort of like wants to be the fucking utility player. It's like, what are you talking on this team? I'm pretty sure you can do what you want, but usually we haven't seen that from him. So was this just a one-off, do you think? Was it in general? What do you think?
I think that's how it should be for Splyce, because they don't play for lane from their bot lane. Their bot lane should get punished in lane, and against good 2v2s does get punished in lane a lot. So then they need somewhere to play around, and that should be top lane. And when they do, when Odo's on these champions, he looks really good. Splyce makes sense. They don't just get bodied early game. And then every time he's on a tank, it's not that... like, Odo on tanks is really good, but then they don't have a bot lane that necessarily facilitates that in terms of having options early game. So then Splyce just looks like then they're a team that's just playing for like 3 or 4 item spike on Kabe with the support that does well with, at that point with ADs, which is a really one-dimensional slow way to play. So I hope they keep Odo on carries if they want to play the way they want, the way they're playing for bot lane, because every time he is on carries, Splyce legitimately feels like a threat early game. And when he's not on a carry, then it's like, it just feels like it's on us to snowball the game.
Also, like, the thing about Splyce is that after a while, you kind of identify a few picks that they have that they use kind of as crutches, and Camille is one of them. Like, they use Camille, Zach, and like Zaire Khan as sort of crutches. Those are their best picks, and I feel like they maybe just tunneled on having those picks all the time, and people just weren't denying them enough. And you saw some of the issues when they couldn't get consistently like 2 or 3 of them against G2. They had a lot more troubles. But if you do watch the way Xerxes plays, like, as much as Odoamne says he doesn't really want to play carries, like, they did end up having to make it so that Xerxes either pathing towards top, or he passed towards bot and like backs early before he can even buy first jungle item, and then just goes top and wards or ganks or whatever. So it was very much the roaring Romanian duo, or whatever, however they want to go with it. So that just ended up being Splyce's best way of playing. I think a lot of that has to do with Kasing's champion pool. Like, a lot of people say stuff like, oh, well, Kasing just plays these picks because they're the best for the team or whatever, but he is the easiest support to draft against. Like, the easiest support to draft against, because it's just, like, in our series, we just didn't play to our, like, we should have played to bot, because I think our bot lane almost took, or not series, but game, I think our bot lane almost took the stupid tower on their own. because he was forced onto Lulu, and he was like not going to do anything with that pick. So, yeah, it was just it's really strange, and I feel like that will be a difficulty for them in summer unless he opens up his champion pool or they start playing different stuff. So,
but I also think it's like a little bit difficult for him because like Xerxes is best on like Zac is his best champion, and after that I can't name a champion that I can say Xerxes is like a top 3 jungler on after Zac. And I think a big reason for that is because when he's on tempo junglers, he just doesn't seem as scary as Jankos or Maxlore or Memento, who understand how tempo works and how like what map advantage is supposed to get from it. So with that said, once Zac is taken away, then you're trying to play these carry versus carry top lane matchups, or Camille versus tanks, where she can kind of get pressured in lane. You need a jungler that understands tempo or is able to abuse his tempo or understands how to play against enemy junglers. Tempo, but I don't think Xerxes necessarily understands that. So in a lot of ways, Odo ends up playing from a bad position because he has to over-respect enemy jungler because of fog of war or like for whatever reason it may be. And Zac kind of helps with that because if Zac's in fog, then there's always a little bit of pressure in every lane, and so it makes it easy for champions like Camille to get through. So I agree on the crush thing. I think the biggest crush though for at least in early game is on Xerxes being on Zac, because once he's taken away from that, I legitimately think it becomes hard for Odo to play the game a lot of the times if enemy jungler has a tempo jungler. And what G2 did so well was that they always had a tempo jungler. Even if it wasn't in favor of G2, and the jungle matchup, it didn't matter because you can still abuse Xerxes in terms of understanding tempo better.
Yeah, there was I don't know, that was the Fnatic Fatality series. Yeah. So that's most agreed.
In the series against Roccat, already pleb fans will be like, why are you talking about Odo Amne? Shut the fuck up. What about Niski, my boy Niski? And obviously, we have addressed him on past shows. I rudely to Odo Amne suggested he's like Nesquik, the cheap and nasty chocolate milkshake alternative for people who don't know how to buy either a chocolate or real milkshakes. But in this series, everyone was going crazy because, but the kills, Kelsey, the kills, 22 kills. But overall, adding it into the G2 series, what do you think of Niski in Splyce?
I mean, obviously he played Caston, which I think is an excellent champion, by the way. And he played Swain, I think. I don't know.
Yes.
I think
played against G2.
Yeah, I think for and he played Orianna. So I think they gave him counterpick mid, I think, in almost every situation, which I think is ideal, except for the swing game. They give him counterpick mid in almost every situation, and I feel like that's you kind of have to, right, with Niski. Otherwise, it's very rare that he will actually get mid priority. It's very rare that he'll actually do anything. And then they ended up, I think, playing fairly well to use their side lanes to help him get advantages. Like there was, I think in the Swain game, they just like obviously the annoying thing about Swain is how well he does group fights or skirmishes or whatever. So like collapsing mid with Swain and getting Swain ahead is really, really viable. And they don't usually play like that, but I think that helped him get ahead. And to his credit, he did play fairly well with that lead. So yeah.
Hussain.
Also, like in the Swain game, like game 1 against G2, they were losing that game still, and not because of him, but because of bot lane. But the reason, like, I don't think Niski himself necessarily did anything special in that game. It's just G2 didn't know how to play 1-3-1 against. Well, G2 just didn't play 1-3-1 correctly that game. They didn't execute it, and then Sivir hit 3 items. Like I think that was just Swain being a champion, or like being the champion that he is, rather than Niski doing anything special on Swain. So like he's an average mid laner. Like he's not going to. I don't expect Niski to create his own advantages ever, but he'll go even. And if your side lanes are strong, then he'll function well. And like on Splyce, it's a bit iffy because their bot lane doesn't play for lane dominance or priority or anything like that. So then it kind of needs to be on him and Odo to have priority in the lane or to have some advantages in early game. But I don't think he's the type of player that always facilitates that. I think in a winning matchup he can to some extent, but I don't think it's nearly consistent enough. Like he's not a perks in that sense.
Was this semi-final, the G2 Splyce one, as underwhelming as the other one? in your book?
It was underwhelming from Splyce, I think. I still expected them to play a lot better than they did, and felt like they got worse game by game, almost. Because game one, G2 should have won, the one that Splyce eventually did win. G2 should have won, but then Splyce won in typical Splyce fashion. They had a comp where they have an Ardent support and a 3-item AD carry or 4-item AD carry. They got to that point, and then they just win team fights because they have the better team fight comp. That's Splyce's main playbook. The only variation to that is having Zac or Camille from top and jungle. So it was surprising that I don't think G2 ever stopped Splyce necessarily from getting anything too comfort, especially from support. I think they got something comfortable in pretty much every game, if I'm not mistaken. I guess game 3 and 4 was a little bit iffy with Morgana Shen, but game 1 and 2, they had comfort champions pretty much across the board. But they didn't have any crutch champion. I think that showed how weak Splyce really is. Because I think they have 1 or 2 comps or champions that they depend on to win. And I also don't like the way Splyce approaches the game from their bot lane. I think it's really greedy to go that route. So I was glad to see, I think it was disappointing from Splyce and really impressive from G2, the way they approached this series and how they won it, because they just kept going for a fast tempo, fast clear jungler, and they didn't fall into the trap that a lot of teams do against Splyce, which is, okay, we'll take right side and last pick support and you'll counter pick a Sing. It doesn't necessarily work because then you both just end up scaling. So they just stuck to their plan, which is they had a strong 2v2 in almost every single game. They used that lead with a fast jungler pretty well to snowball bot lane, and except for one game, they legitimately did a good job of snowballing the game. I think G2 still showed a lot of weaknesses come mid to late transitions, and I think it'll hurt them against Fnatic, but they finally abused Splyce for what no one else was seemingly doing for most of the split, which is their horrendous early game, really.
Yeah, I think also to an extent with Splyce, they're really weird about how they use their top laner mid to late. They almost never, unless he's on Camille, they almost never push past River. It's very bizarre. So I think that's one of the best ways to deal with G2, is to split their attention in mid to late. And so Splyce weren't able to have a really good comeback system like they usually do against a lot of teams, because they kept trying to force mid. And G2 were happy with that because G2 are really weird with how they execute in close games, and that just gives them a really, really easy way to end the game. So yeah, and obviously, one thing that I want to emphasize about this series though is that everyone was losing their shit about how good Splyce's draft was or something in game 1, and I was like, dude, G2's draft is actually such a good answer to this comp. You have the Ryze, you have the Gangplank, you have Tahm Kench, so that they can't side lane, they have to go mid. And then, Gangplank Jhin is such a broken combination. You have Tempo Jungle, Ryze. I don't know. It was just so weird to me that people thought Splyce's draft was a god draft. So I don't know.
I mean, the only response Splyce should have had that game is Sion going mid, them starting Baron, and then Sion turning on Baron, because he's the only engaged. Outside of that, there is no way for Splyce to stop G2 from 1-3-1. None at all. And so I was really unhappy when G2 failed to do that this game, because I don't think a lot of people understand that this thing that Europe and NA has right now, more so NA, but still, where you just draft a better 5v5 comp and just play for farm catching waves and then eventually just engage on them at Baron. It's such a linear and thoughtless way to play the game, because a good team will punish you for it. A good team that understands how to use side waves properly, or how to pressure towers properly, or how to create picks with side waves properly will destroy you for playing like this. And Splyce should be beaten. If they keep their style, they should lose a lot of games once, because they showed it they didn't change their style really for most of the split. And so it was kind of sad to see that no one from Europe could get good enough, except for Fnatic, could get good enough to actually beat it. And so I was surprised that G2 was able to get to that level, personally.
Yeah, I actually thought Splyce should be favored to win this.
I don't think G2's bottom would be good enough to abuse, but they did. That was surprising.
Was Jan unexpected in his performance?
I think Jhin was the perfect champion for him. it's safe laning phase, sometimes like even or winning laning phase. It has CC, it's long range, it's like safe for team fights. It has engage, and I don't know like personally, but everyone that knows Yordan says that he's really smart about the game. So I imagine he understands when you should be picking fights. So I think Jin's the perfect champion for him, and it just happened to be in the meta. I don't think Splyce practiced it at all because they didn't practice it till game 4, I think it was. So like I just think he looked that good because he did play well, but he also got a champion that's perfectly suited for what he brings to a team. And it happens to be one of the strongest ADs on this patch.
And it's like somewhere between the Trist and the Varus that they were playing all season, where it actually like can scale and still have engage. And I also, Kjarnan will always, his best champions have always been like the Sivir, like Jhin. He did play a lot of Jhin, so I think it's like he wants those types of champions that can sort of direct or lead the team in some way. And he's like, everyone has given credit to Kasing for being some kind of leader, but it really, and Kasing has even come out and admitted this, but like Kjarnan has always been sort of the voice in that duo. And he was a big reason why Roccat was like semi-successful in the previous year and were able to come up with so many upsets. So I think it's like, Kjarnan is best in those types of situations. So like this is a good meta for him because he can theoretically play Ashe, he can theoretically play Jhin, he can theoretically play like Sivir. So yeah.
The only downside of Kjarnan is that his mechanics are like just not up to par. His team fighting, his mechanics, his laning, like as an individual player,
as an AD carry.
Yeah, like as an individual player, he's in the wrong role, to be honest. He should have been a support player, or he should have been a jungler. Like he's legitimately seems really smart about the game, the way he moves around the map. It's just unfortunate the role he chose because he's always going to be a focal point of his role and something he's always going to be weak at. And I think he's going to get exposed for it really hard against Fnatic because like even though the meta suits him, I think outside of Jhin, like Ashe and what was the other one you said?
Sivir.
Right?
He was always kind of like a Sivir player, yeah.
Yeah, I think Fnatic will know how to treat these champions in lane and like their strengths in terms of having engage options for mid game. I don't think that's gonna like Fnatic is a team that likes being engaged on. If all their setups involve around them, they're just going around doing their own thing, and if anyone engages on them, then they're ready to react. They don't necessarily go out of the way to find engages. So I think in that sense, it's kind of a mismatch as well because G2's only saving grace should be come mid game. Yordan will know how to pick fights, but Fnatic is a team that wants that to happen anyway. That they tend to bait these fights a lot. So I just think this matchup is really skewed outside of mid jungle.
And unless you're willing to first pick Tristana, you should probably ban it against Fnatic because, and I don't think they will first pick Tristana, but that's like the only late game team fighting AD carry he can really play because of its free reposition and long range. Woo! So. Yeah, I think that's going to be a huge issue for them as well. And I agree, like both G2 and Fnatic are a little bit weird in that sense that they are a little bit timid, like mid to late, about contesting Baron Vision, about doing a bunch of stuff like this. So I think these are teams that like Fnatic does have the slight advantage and they will be happy if G2 tries to force a fight in mid lane because then they don't have to worry about contesting any of that stuff and they'll be perfectly fine. So
why is it not been a problem for Fnatic? Indeed, when people talk about this final, most people actually I saw were saying they think Fnatic's going to win the final. Why is it not an issue to not have SOAS?
So I don't know if this is true or not, but like if what's his top in his name?
Wipo?
Yeah, if he's on tanks, like his role is not that much different from SOAS, and what SOAS then brings.
This was all a fucking master plan by SOAS to show how utterly worthless the top lane was. He's like, I'll literally let anyone play the role, and my team still wins. Look,
I mean, it kind of is. He's had a whole split to watch SOAS play and watch how SOAS communicates on these champions, and so it's not that hard for him to replicate it. Like if it was carry versus carry, like matchups top lane, maybe it gets hard because there's a lot more information to process, but. When it's tank versus tank, it's really just priority and how to find engages and how to communicate your TPs or when you have roam chances. The game is a lot easier and there's a lot more room to just not worry about your individual play and just think about the game. And then it's like the perfect scenario. Like Fnatic's never really played through top, so it's not like they're using a side of the map. They're still going to play through the same side of the map. It's still going to be the same people communicating early game. It's still going to be the same snowball, like the same voice as snowball in the game. It's just the voice that finds a lot of engages is different now, but it's not that if he has, like I know they've used him a lot in scrims, so it's not like he's not practiced with them, and he's watched Soaz play a lot.
In what context? They were just using him anywhere during the split,
I think like
before the injury?
Yeah, they were giving him like at least one game a day usually.
Okay.
So like usually like the last game of the day.
Was there any logic behind that? I mean, I would guess Soaz probably doesn't want to have to play every game anyway. You know.
Yeah.
Of all the players who might give up a game. You know?
I'm assuming like they just want to build up a sub, and like at a certain point in your career, playing every single game is not as beneficial as just watching VODs or just thinking about the game more. So
I mean, he would just take off the second bye, just go and
yeah,
just play every game. It's not beneficial.
Just go grab a beer and watch.
Exactly.
People,
yeah, I think in the European scene right now, because the national leagues is so huge, like I mean, I say huge, and it's still like there's a giant gap between National League and LCS play, and there's nowhere near the amount of like global visibility or whatever. But it's almost better to further your career in terms of like becoming a better player or understanding like what you're going to do to go to a national league than it is to go to the EU LCS, because it's very rare that you have in-house subs. It's very rare that you get game time. So I think that if you're going to get a player that you actually think is a really good prospect and you want to build him up and you want to have him as a sub and you think that he might be good as like a future top laner or something, then you really have to give him something, right? You really have to give him, like, either whether it's to sign him as a sub and just give him like the sub stipend and then kind of hold him for the future, but still let him play with National League teams, whether that's to bring him in-house and do that sort of thing, or whether that's to give him game time, like in scrims. Like, you have to be willing to offer him something besides just being a sub, or he will definitely just go to a National League team and then someone else might see him performing super well and like challenge France and pick him up, and then you're screwed and you don't get that prospect anymore. So yeah, I think it makes sense from like that perspective for Fnatic to be giving him game time.
And also it's just beneficial because like the thing is, a lot of pros, when they first become pros, they're more intuitive about their play. They have a certain playbook that they feel confident in, that they've used in solo queue a lot, and they try to bring that to competitive. And then once people start learning the game more, a lot of these playmaking attributes get forgotten when you're trying to learn macro really heavily. So I think having subs is always useful in terms of practice, because regardless of how much veterancy you have, new players will always have better plays to show you, just because they are in touch with the solo queue meta of trying to find like the cheesiest or fastest way to get an advantage. And so in that sense, it's always useful to have someone else play, just so you can find like new plays for your playbook.
Can this not be a scenario, though, where Wonder can do a lot for G2? I mean, you think of all the stuff he's playing Camille. I mean, he played fucking Swain in the playoffs. What else? Gangplank, obviously, is another thing he played. I mean, in theory, he's not just a guy who's just going to play tanks, right?
Yeah.
I think, I mean, that's pretty much G2's win condition, is they're pretty good mid jungle. They're really good top jungle. So there is a window for abuse, but it's the same, like, it's basically the same tactic that Vitality took against Fnatic. Like, it's doable. If anyone does it, it'll be G2. They like, Wonder is having an insane split. So if anyone does abuse topside against Fnatic, it will be G2. But it just comes down to who is going to be faster at snowballing, G2 topside or Fnatic bot side. And I think it'll be Fnatic. I just think it's in the current meta, I think it's a lot easier or a lot faster just to go through bot lane. And especially if Fnatic is starting to play like these more early game AD carries, which they didn't play Ezreal during the split, except for like till they had guaranteed first place. So if they're starting to play these AD carries legitimately, then what that tells me that they're really confident in snowballing any early game lead they have and playing mid game really aggressively. So all of Wonder's champions, Camille, Gangplank, etc., should take more time than what Fnatic has in the playbook. But it's definitely possible. And there's also the factor where Soaz, with his experience and just he does bring a lot in terms of comms for Fnatic. And even if he's getting pressured by an enemy, like by one to split push, he would know how to contribute. But I don't know if Reaper will necessarily know how to do that. If he's getting pressure, I don't know if he'll hold up on stage, if he'll shut down, if he'll start concentrating more on his individual play and not provide as many engage options. So that's where like the only way it can hurt Fnatic is if Reaper fails to find engages, I think, come mid-late. But that's where, you know, there's a counterpoint where G2 will try to find engages themselves on Yordan, and Fnatic will be pretty happy with that.
I actually do, like, as much as we talked about, there's not necessarily that big of a difference between Soaz and Bwipo. Like, between them as individual players, I actually do think that there is a big difference. Like, if you watch their games and how Bwipo plays, like Soaz is very good at using top advantages to impact mid lane, for example. Like, and Bwipo sometimes tries to do this, and his execution fails, and things as simple as like his path from top to mid lane. Or I think there was that scenario in the Vitality Fnatic game too, where Vitality were invading Fnatic's blue buff, and then he goes like this most counterintuitive way around to try to defend, and then like Cabochard is like 1v3ing or something and kills someone. So I think that there's definitely some issues with how Bwipo is playing. And then even if you look at his landing phase, like some of the trades he picks are really bad. But so I think that, there are definitely issues. And since like one way in which G2 is also a good matchup to Splyce is that both of them will play top jungle 2v2. And I feel like G2 have more ways to play that, the top jungle 2v2, than Splyce did. So it was really difficult for them to necessarily get ahead like that. And I think that if G2 execute the top jungle 2v2 really well, that is a point that they can abuse. And Vitality even had some success with it, but they were only able to really do it with Camille. So if G2 can do it on a more variety of champions, like if they can do it on the Gnar, if they can do it on the Ornn, like these are all champions that Wunder has played, then I think that could be something that they could do to get far ahead. But I still would question their ability to execute as the game continues. And even as we like praise Hjarnan's engage sense, because I feel like Hjarnan's team fight positioning isn't that good. He really is only good at getting picks. Like their team G2 is really only good at getting picks. So Fnatic will still like hard out team fight them if they try to force a 5v5. So.
And also I suspect that Wunder will like, I don't think he'll get Camille. And if he doesn't, then I'm pretty sure he'll end up on Gnar or Gangplank. I don't think they would want him on Ornn, even though it makes sense for them, just because I think they want to abuse through topside, and Ornn abuses mid more than top. And
true.
I think, like, I suspect that G2 will try to go through top lane. So, like, if Camille is banned, then I think just Gnar, Gangplank just have a lot less punish in terms of 1v1 than a Camille does. And so in that sense, like his job is, he doesn't need to be a playmaker. He doesn't even need to find plays. He just needs to be ready for whatever play Fnatic wants to make, or the rest of Fnatic wants to make. And I think it'll be easy for him to do that if he's not against Camille.
So with these two teams and another set of players, obviously we have our candidates for best mid laner in the EU. Outside of the context of this matchup, who would you pick of the two as the best?
Caps. For the split. Just because Perks had that slump in the middle where he was, I think it was like week 6 to or 5 to 8 or 6 to 9, something like that. But he just seemed really, really out of it. His laning was okay. He was making very uncharacteristic mistakes in terms of when he's trying to roam from his lane, etc. Or he was warding camps where they either knew where the jungler was and getting picked off. So he was making a lot of mistakes. It just seemed like he was a little bit out of it. He seems better. At least in his series against Splyce, he seemed better. So, like, I don't think Brooks is ever going to be a bad player come playoff time. But for the most part, Caps has just been a better performer overall. He's like, I remember this one game. I think it was against, actually, it might have been against G2 themselves, where he was pretty much the only engage, and his engage was Azir ult. And they won that game because he just kept finding these engages. Like, Caps has been making a lot of plays outside of lane this year that he wasn't necessarily looking for last year. So he seemed improved in that sense.
Yeah, so this is the first split that I haven't had an individual EU LCS MVP vote or whatever, because obviously I'm on a team now, but I would have had to write an article justifying it because I would vote Caps over Reckless. So for me, like, obviously that doesn't necessarily make him the best mid laner in the league, but I do think he's the best mid laner in the league for this split because this guy, like, it's really even on the macro points that, like, you really emphasize against Fnatic more than any other team that if you're going to make a roam or initiate a roam on priority, you can't do it on the wave resetting, because if Caps will go to the other side of the map and he'll make something way more impactful happen than you will if you make the play on the wave resetting instead of doing it on priority. So for me, he's just been, like, really fundamental to how this team plays out early game. He's been really fundamental to how the team is, like, playing their team fights. And the only really effective way to get at Fnatic early on is to kind of take advantage of the fact that their warding and their vision control around mid is really shit. And that's because you destabilize Caps, who's the center of their map, who does so much work for this team. And then, so I think that for me, Caps is just a really, really strong player. And basically, like, in the game that we played against them in the second half, we weren't able to, like, Fnatic were really indecisive about closing that, but we basically got, our team basically got 1v5 by Caps. So, yeah, that's what happened.
He doesn't choke under pressure anymore. Like, I remember before, like, last year, especially in his series against us, like, it just seemed like come playoff time, it wasn't the same as playing against Caps during regular split. Like, you could tell that there was a lot more pressure. He was playing a lot more reserved, or he was overextending too much to try to force a play. And this year he seems, and I don't know, like, it could be just because of how much Fnatic has been dominating the second half, but he seems a lot more consistent, a lot more stable. Like, he seems like a smarter player this year, where last year was like almost a meme, where with Caps it's like you can always find a play mid because he won't have any vision and he's going to be under your tower. Mm-hmm. So he's become a smart player. I think he understands how to play with Roccat better now, or rather the lack of vision that Roccat provides around mid better now. So, and also his bot lane's been a lot better this year as well. So that naturally helps. Like, if your bot lane is winning almost every 2v2, then that naturally helps mid lane a lot as well, because support has first reset, they're mid first, so you can play a lot more aggressive, you have more windows. So I like, it's possibly a factor that Caps looks this good because of how much better the bot lane is doing, or rather survives early game. And maybe he's playing the exact same way, I'm not sure, but he's still come mid-late game. Caps is a much better player this year so far.
And Rekka's even said part of the reason why he's not, like, side laning anymore is because Caps understands, like, the flow of the minions and the game and how to do that better. So now Caps is able to do that. And so the way Caps plays his mid to late macro is a lot better as well. So.
Right, what do you predict as the outcome of the third, fourth place game and the Splyce Vitality match?
I don't know, this one's such a hard one because both these teams got exposed so hard in the semifinals. I think Splyce will take it 3-1 just because Vitality has a more limiting playstyle than Splyce. Like, Splyce's playstyle is, well, if we don't get snowballed on early, we'll just win because of our composition. Vitality's is, if we don't snowball mid lane early, then we'll just lose the game, or we'll try to force Baron and we'll lose anyway. So I think it's easier for Splyce to play. I think 3-1 Splyce, but I expect it to be a pretty bad series from both ends.
Yeah, I think Splyce will win because they play Kassadin. And no, but it's true though. His entire champion pool is countered by Kassadin. I think Splyce will win because I think that Splyce actually have a better understanding of Baron setups, which is ultimately, like, even if you can't counter Vitality's early game plan, ultimately that will always kind of be their kryptonite. So I think Splyce take it.
After having seen the split and now obviously a couple of playoff series, what is a reasonable assessment of Jizuke, the new mid laner of Vitality, who obviously when they were on their tear was the guy people were naming as, like, potential MVP and all this stuff? What do you make of him overall, Hussain? Putting aside your mild, in your case mild disdain for Vitality and everything else.
I think early on he got a little bit overhyped because of how much help he was getting, but and you could see him struggling towards the middle of the split when Vitality couldn't do that stuff anymore. But I think by the end of the split, Jizuke started learning how to play his lane without Gilius permanently in the bush. So he seems like a good player. He has an okay laning phase. He plays a lot better on stage than scrims, which is at least early on in the split he did, which is an interesting factor for a rookie in his first split to be better on stage. And the fact that he's not shy on stage is, I think, his biggest redeeming factor. But I don't think he'll ever be. I don't see him anytime soon breaking like top 3 European mids. I think he still has a long way to go in terms of learning macro and wave management. I think his biggest selling point is that he's a good playmaker, or rather, he is a good playmaker. He looks for them a lot, and that can't be said for a lot of other mids in Europe. And if he doesn't lose that factor, but he actually learns the map, then I can see him being a good player. But I don't think he'll be a Perks or a Cap. Like, I don't think he's like Caps, where it's a rookie that comes in and you just know that at some point he'll be a top 2 mid in Europe. I don't see that in Jizuke because I don't think his laning phase is as dominant as what Caps was back then, and I don't think he necessarily has the same support that Caps has as well in terms of learning the game.
I think a lot of people rate Jizuke super highly because of how much attention he is getting from the rest of his team in terms of like their setup and how they're able to get him ahead. But I do think the thing for me about Jizuke is that he's does not hesitate to use his leads, and he's very aggressive about, okay, so let's say that he gets the push like level 3 or whatever. He roams to side lane, and then your mid laner like tries to follow him. He'll use that to be able to just make the same play again, because the wave will still be in his favor when he gets back to the lane. Things like this. So he does not hesitate to use his lead or to use like openings like this. And I think that that's something that's really, really difficult to condition or teach a player right away. It usually takes a lot of time. So the fact that he's just like that ballsy early on and that like in tune with where his openings are, I think is really, really good and really positive. So I think he just needs to work on some of the technical aspects, and he can be a really, really solid player. I wouldn't necessarily say he can't be like a top mid, or that he isn't a top mid, because I don't know, there was just something about the mid laners this split, man. Usually like EU mids are super good, but it just felt like, okay, we've got Caps and Perks.
Everyone just accepted that people wanted to farm, and then everyone just farmed mid lane.
Yeah,
I felt like that about League of Legends in Europe this whole split.
Why do you think Froggen's coming back? It's his time, baby. It's time to be the king. Yeah.
It's just, and then like you have Caps and Perks even had like a period where he was underperforming, and now it's just, so yeah, I guess Jizuke is a top 3 mid. Woo!
What do you think about this then? Because obviously H2K played him, so maybe you can give me more insight on this. Yeah. But in the 9 playoff games he played Taliyah in 7 of them, and all the wins came on Taliyah. So I think your team only banned it once or something, right? So why does, if this guy is considered the star player of his team, why does nobody take away the champion he wants to play, basically?
I think that Taliyah is pretty easily counterable by jungle pressure early, and by a mid that like can scale, period. So I think that there's a lot of stuff that you can still do in mid to late with Taliyah. That means that people always say that Taliyah doesn't have a damage ult, so therefore she falls off super hard. But I think her ult is still really useful in almost like every late game situation. So I wouldn't say she necessarily falls off really, really hard. But I do think that there are a lot of answers to Taliyah that people don't always explore. Like, I don't know. I think, I said I wasn't going to bring up the Kassadin, but it was weird because in the series, the game 5, he almost looked like, if you watch the VOD, he almost looked like he didn't want to pick Taliyah there, right? But he didn't have a lot of options. So, yeah, I don't know. It also wasn't something that he started to play a ton until playoffs either. Like he played it, I think maybe 1 or 2 games regular season, but then it just became the thing that he was spamming all the time in solo queue and the thing that he just wanted to play in playoffs, just like very suddenly. So for those reasons, I don't necessarily think the problem was not banning Taliyah against Jizuke.
Did it make sense why he wanted to play it all the time in the context of what their team did? I mean, you would think he'd want some of the things he played before, Rise, etc. Obviously very much in the meta. Mm-hmm. Is there a logic as to why they wanted it, do you think?
I think they were looking for ways to, instead of like taking pressure and putting it to mid, they were looking for ways to take mid and put it into other lanes. Like they started playing around bot much more in playoffs. And all the things that we described about Jizuke being good at, like, or I described at least, about Jizuke being good at, maybe Hussain doesn't completely agree, in terms of like taking openings, and Taliyah gets an opening auto, like level 2, whatever, when she gets to lane, so level 1 even. So it's a champion that would really suit his strengths, I think, so.
A last topic I had to ask you about Hussain is one where it's a really open-ended one, actually. I don't think anyone can have a clear answer to this. It's just going to be your own preference. But since LCS in NA and EU moved to best of ones, whereas LPL, LCK remained in the old formats that they have always had, if you look in these different regions, in LCK and in LPL, you had incredibly dominant teams and you had teams that were like by far the best. Whereas you go in EU LCS and you go in NA LCS, and there was a lot of parity and there was a lot of upset wins all over the place, right? What I want to ask is basically this: like, it doesn't have to be these two options, it's not a binary, but these are the two, what I would say are the obvious things people would put forward as factors. So number one is, yes, best of ones. Okay, you're only playing one game against someone. But the other one that people might forget about is, obviously in both regions, you had insane roster shake-up. Like in NA, it meant there was like a lot of good-looking lineups. In EU, admittedly, there was a lot of underwhelming-looking lineups. But either way you get to it, there was a lot of roster shake-up, right? Which of these factors, perhaps some others, do you think account for this bizarre level of like parity and then, you know, the table standings being up and down all the time? What's your take on it?
I think the parity is more so because of roster changes than best of one. Simply because, like, when you have roster changes and you have these new synergies you need to form, then it just makes, it just means that there's a lot more windows open where teams won't be coordinated and they'll make mistakes. And so, like, a lot of games just look as if they get to late game naturally, or it's just throw after throw after throw, and that's purely because none of the teams have, outside of Fnatic, really have great synergy, and so it's more so like the roster and therefore the mistakes that come with a new roster than best of one that's causing it. But best of one just exaggerates that a little bit. As for whether best of one affects, like, I think long term there will still be more parity in NA and EU than in LCK, or well, I don't know about LPL so much, but at least for LCK, and that's because of best of one. I think best of threes for regular split does do a lot, at least in my experience, in terms of teaching how to be a better team, how to perform better, because you can immediately identify what's not working on stage, whether that's in game or out of game, whether that's a player choking or a team just not pulling the trigger where they normally would. So you can immediately recognize that and then force that change on stage right away, where in best of one, you're kind of stuck doing that the day after or the next week. And so you don't really get to practice, or you don't get to see and or practice affecting like points where players or teams choke that much in best of one. And I think that creates a lot of parity as well, because in LCK, for example, if someone's choking, well, I assume they get windows where they get to sort of try to control that a little bit, and then scrims and stage starts replicating more. And in scrims, more often than not, there is like there's not that much parity in scrims, at least in my experience of split. It was very clear who was number 1, 2, 3, 4 in scrims for us. So I think long term, best of one will play more of a factor in parity, but right now I think it's way more roster shuffle.
I kind of agree, but I think for NA and EU, one big factor that you didn't mention, which is something that you've been talking about the entire show, which is that there's some sort of implicit agreement in EU and especially NA, where we're going to take all 5 players and we're going to fight mid, and then the winner is going to get Baron and win the game. And I think
the winner claims his spoils the Baron.
And that type of situation, there's a very, like, from the opening of the game, if the game is even by like 20 minutes or whatever, there's a very clear team that's going to win based on the draft. Yeah. And
we have to understand
that doesn't have to be the better team. That doesn't have to be whatever. No. It's just the team with the better 5v5 comp. And so I think that creates a lot of parity as well.
You have to understand, Kelsey, this has its roots in European military history, because, you know, there were these rules, like, for example, the British created, where in war you actually had to, like, you line up your soldiers, you each take turns to move your soldiers forward at a certain rhythm, you know. You're not allowed sneak attacks, guerrilla tactics, you know, you're side laning, as it were, on the military battlefield. You have to fight in this manner, because that's obviously famously one of the ways that I call them the snitch bitches. You call them Americans. That's one of the ways they actually found an initial foothold into the war. Well, I call one of the unjust wars of history. And, you know, that's actually part of the reason why you're not talking like, yes, Governor, I agree, Thorin. The problem is I can't do your voice anyway. I definitely can't do Dick Van Dyke Americanized British version of your voice on top of that. This video was supported by Dean Tanglis, Twch, Sanity, Gman, Kokupsi, Andreas Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, VeXii, Kevin Haupt, Jason A, and Travis G. Greb. Want to suggest a guest to appear on my show or a topic to discuss? Perhaps you'd like to ask me a question. In 2018, for the first time in history, you can directly influence and support my content with the Patreon link below. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today.